You're listening to What's Contemporary Now, a show about culture and the people, places, and things that together make it up. Having first opened its doors in 1997, PR Consulting has maintained its position as one of the most recognizable and respected names in fashion PR. Today, we sit down with founder Pierre Rougier and talk about his early days as a college dropout that went to work for Hermès. We also talk about the evolution of the industry across the decades his career now spans, and his appreciation of the newfound impossible task of bullshitting in the age of access and information. Having had his own adventures in elitism, he notably agrees that its time now feels past and reveals what he thinks are the lasting secrets to discovering and developing a strong and successful brand.
This is Pierre Rougier, and we're talking about what's contemporary now.
Pierre Rougier, obviously people know you for your incredible career in being the founder of PR Consulting, but what was life like before you decided to study something like poli-sci and pursue a career in fashion?
Life was, life of a French hick living in the countryside, really. Except for my mother, who was an avid consumer of fashion. That's usually what happens. But I lived in a small village in the countryside, and fashion was far removed from our world. But I always had an interest in it, direct or indirect. But I always thought, that's interesting. I always had a sense of what you could do with fashion. But my life was very, living in a small village with friends, very free. And then it changed when I went to boarding school, which was much less free and much less fun. And I think that started my rebellious streak because I hated being in boarding school. But it was in a bigger city. So I guess I also got connected to style or, fashion. I went to boarding school and college in Bordeaux, which was a very bourgeois town. But still, it was very like Hermès scarf and a string of pearls for the mothers. And, as young boys, because I was in an all-boys school, we had a sense of fashion. And that's something that I find has changed a lot, is our sense of fashion was very catered a lot to young people, youth. We were not aware of the big brands. It was like brands of jeans and things that we liked that were very much geared toward young people and teenagers. So that was my life. I studied political science, which I absolutely hated.
Why did you hate it?
I think I just didn't like the path that it was putting me on. Early on, I realized that I was surrounded with people who had very clear ambitions about what they wanted to do out of it. And I had no interest in those careers. Being gay, I think, had something to do with it, and feeling not exactly gay, but in the closet. So not feeling connected to a lot of people around me gave me a sense of I wanted something other. I wanted something different. And I actually didn't graduate from college. I left a few months before graduation.
And didn't you say at one point that when you decided to leave school, your parents actually cut you off financially?
They sure did. They absolutely did. So I moved to Paris and, I wouldn't call her a girlfriend because she was definitely not a girlfriend, but I would say a girl who was a friend of mine in mischief mainly. And she was very connected in Paris. So her father was in Bordeaux. She was in Bordeaux. I met her there, but then we moved to Paris together. And I had to find a way of making a living. So I did whatever. I was like usher in a theater. I was like doing like survey, like opinion polls on the streets, faking them, obviously, going home and filling them out on my own with fake names. I mean, just making by, but having a good time, having fun, probably partying way too much. And then my goal was always somehow that I wanted to learn English. So I kind of like moved into an idea that I was going to move to London somehow, but I needed to earn a little bit of money to do that. At the time, a friend of mine, who's still my best friend to this day, she got every one of her friends a summer job somehow at Hermès. So I joined. At first, I was like packing things in the basement, which was a very long tutorial to know how to pack an Hermès box, all of this kind of very detailed ways of folding the paper inside a box and etc. So I was there for about a month. Then I still needed to make money. They moved me to the, at the time you could be a phone receptionist. So I was a phone receptionist at Hermès for a while, at Hermès Bonjour. And then one day they were about to have their first fashion show and they needed help in the press office. So A wonderful woman who was there, the head of PR there, called Flavie Chaillet, hired me for literally putting stamps on envelopes because you were still mailing invitations at the time and just running around doing things. So that was my first real contact with PR, fashion.
But you had decided to leave, right? It wasn't really vibing with you at some point?
I didn't want to stay. Yeah, no, I was like literally on my path to go to London. That was my thing. Also, it was like, I mean, I'm going to date myself, but it was the 80s and London was fun. And it was like, Culture Club and Boy George and all this stuff. I think also the idea of I need to go because, again, this kind of idea of being gay. And I thought maybe if I go to London and all this culture that was coming at us was very gay friendly or openly gay. So, Flavie, like this lovely woman at Hermès, said like, okay, well, I'm going to hire you full time. You're good at this. And I was like, no, I'm moving to London. And she said, well, I'm going to move you to London for Hermès. And then you'll come back when you're done with your London obsession. You can come back and work with me. I was, well, that's great. Now I have a job in London. So I moved to London with that job. I stayed in London for a year and a half, blurry year and a half, but I was there I ended up being a bartender in a super trendy bar and, having a good time. And then eventually I had to move back to Paris. And when I moved to Paris, a friend of mine from the little village that I grew up in was working at Yohji Yamamoto. And I was struggling. I didn't have a job, wondering what I was going to do. And she said, didn't you work in a press office or something? I said, yeah, I did. And she's like, well, there's an opening at Yohji. So I applied. I was interviewed by Marc Ascoli, who's still around. I still see him. He interviewed me, gave me the job. I think my big break at Yohji was that I spoke English very well since I had been in London. And they were about to open a press office in London. So little, third assistant me ended up being the one who kind of was going to London to open the office, find people to populate the office. I had no idea what I was doing, but at least the people at Yohji trusted me to do it. So I was back and forth between Paris and London. I was also at Yohji in like the late 80s, and Yohji and Comme des Garçons were a bit of an anomaly at the time when it was kind of like wild and crazy, and it was all black and austere and very against the trend, but it became obviously a phenomenon. Also, the work ethic, there was no joke. There was a lot of fun going on in fashion, but when you enter the Yohji offices, the smile was off. You just had to really be very serious and work very, very hard. And I remember one of the things that still sticks in my mind is at the time, as long as someone was working in the building, you could not leave the building.
What do you mean?
Well, 100 people came from Japan to prepare the show. They came with thousands of samples. I mean, thousands of samples that were laid out everywhere. And they were really putting the show together there in Paris for about 10, 12 days before the show. So if you were part of the show, kind of pod, if a seamstress was working until 6 a.m., no one left. We all stayed. So you would like sleep in your office, you would sleep in between like your racks, but you would not leave until the job was done. And then everybody could go home or not go home and start again.
There's definitely a difference. And it is an interesting point to look at because people often talk about the disparity in work ethic of the current generation who understands the importance of boundaries versus having come into the industry at a time like what you're describing. Have you had to sort of navigate that or?
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely had to learn to navigate that and respect people's boundaries and private lives. And, I don't think it was better then or it's better now. It's just the way it was done. We didn't question it. It was just the way it was, and yeah, it's a very different way of looking at what work means, what dedication to, I don't know, a greater purpose, if there's such a thing in fashion.
Do you feel like having been cut off from your parents at the time that you were gave you the experience that developed the grit that allowed you to sustain roles like the one you had at Yohji and obviously going on to do what you've done since?
I don't know. I think my parents cut me off financially, but we were always close. I mean, they just like, you want to be on your own. Well, then you're on your own. But, we're still emotionally connected. I think what it taught me is because, I come from a French bourgeois. My father was an industrialist, whatever. But it taught me that if you make choices, with choices come consequences, and consequences are usually on you. Action, reaction.
Having worked with Hermès, obviously we've discussed some of your experiences during the time of Yohji. You worked with Margiela. In 1997, you decided to spin off officially on your own and then start your own company. What was the genesis of that idea?
Well, I left Yohji to go work with Martin Margiela at the time. Actually, I left Yohji to, at the time, open my own office. I thought I was going to open a PR office. I had a lot of connections in London. A lot of friends were pushing me to open an office to take on a lot of like young English designers. At the time, it was Jasper Conran, John Galliano, all this kind of like generation, plus the Belgian Six, which were the kind of underground, intriguing group of designers that was coming out of Belgium. And I had also Catherine Hamnet was one of the clients that were willing to join my yet to be born office. And then I went on to try and meet all the Belgian Six. And I met Anne de Burmester, I met Walter, and eventually I met Martin and his partner Jenny. We had a great meeting. And then the following day, Jenny, Martin's partner, called me and said, we, really enjoy meeting you. We'd love to work with you, but we're not going to go into someone's office. So if you want to work with us, you come in and work for us. And I don't know what possessed me. I said, sure. And I dropped everything else and I went and worked with Martin. He had done I think one show at the time. And I think he was about to do his second show. The runway was the bloody footprints and all of that. So, but I don't know what possessed me. I was like, sure. And I just went and worked. I think there was such a vision. I came from such a house of Yohji taught me you have vision and you have to stick to it. So I kind of was taken by it, I guess, So I went and I worked with him for 4 years. Then I was kind of tired of looking at the world through one lens. And that's something that stayed with me. The idea of when you work in a house that's so strong, you really have to look at the world through one aesthetic, one sense of fashion, a vision of the world. And I grew tired of it at some point. I just thought I need to go. So I left. I was floating around doing odd jobs in PR companies and stuff. And then at some point, Martin and Jenny said, you need to get out of Paris. You need to go to, New York or something. So they set me up for a job in New York. I moved to New York. Thanks to Martin and Jenny, I was offered a job as communications director of Onward Kashiyama, which at the time had a subsidiary in Italy that was producing Helmut Lang, Vivienne Westwood, all these kind of designers through their manufacturing company in Italy. So I became communication director for that because they were starting a line with Michael Kors called ICB. And Michael Kors was at the time in between jobs. I think he had gone bankrupt with his own business. He was designing that collection. So I started in that company. And then I met through friends, someone called Narciso Rodriguez, who had just done Karen Bisset's wedding dress. So he was working for Cerruti at the time. He was the talk of America because he had designed that dress. And he was about to start his own line. And he said, you have to be my PR. You have to be my PR. I said, I can't. I work for Kashiyama. He said, well, quit, start your company. Take Kashiyama as a client and I'll be your client. So I did. And Kashiyama agreed. They became my client. And Narciso was my founding client. But luckily, at the time, Helmut Lang was part of my previous employer, the roster of designers, decided to move all his operation to New York. So he asked me to take it on. Helmut Lang, which at the time also was the Holy Grail.
It was the time of Helmut at Helmut, right?
Yes. Helmut at Helmut, and the first shows in New York. And, this obviously, I had worked with him when I was at Onward Kashiyama, but never so directly. So I took that on. And then about the same time, Martin Margiela started the collections at Hermès. And so Hermès and Martin asked me to take care of those collections because they didn't have the infrastructure in New York and the staff to really handle a fashion collection of that nature. So I started my little company with Helmut Lang, Narciso Rodriguez, and Hermès Margiela, which was not too bad, out of my living room.
And Balenciaga also came not long after, right?
Very quickly in there, Balenciaga came. I met Nicolas through an old friend of mine, Pierre Rougier. He introduced me to Nicolas. And he was just also starting at Balenciaga. I think he had done one show maybe. And he asked me if I would take it on, which I gladly did. And, very quickly it became a thing, a big, favorite. But what I want to go back to is when I worked at Yohji was not in trend. When I worked at Martin was not in trend. And what I learned is that when the trends are so strong, the opposite of the trend is usually, I mean, if it's if it's good, the opposite of the trend is likely to come up. When Nicolas was doing Balenciaga, it was like a UFO had landed in fashion. When Yohji and Comme des Garçons arrived in Paris, the time of Jean-Paul Gaultier and his very crème mugler, I learned from those people, from those designers, that when the vision is so strong, even if it's against the trend, when they're talented like they are, then it swings back to them. And that's something that I really love.
Well, that's also a really good opportunity to sort of jump to present day, because obviously you've sustained success across decades at this point, and there is a bit of a paradoxical nature to time when it comes to something like fashion, because there are things that change and there are things that stay the same, even though you think they've changed. So navigating the industry obviously requires a very agile way of thinking. And that's a perfect example of something that you'll always know is inevitably going to happen, in terms of the antithesis to a trend being an opportunity if the vision is strong. But what other through lines have you found to stand the test of time when it comes to PR and effective brand management for designers that you're working with?
If you've been, as you said, around for a few decades, you realize you see things coming back that you've seen before. So that gives you a very kind of, warped sense of time. What I think has shifted a lot is a lot of people who adopt a trend today, and it's not a negative, but they don't really need the reference. They don't need to know that Jean-Paul did it in the 80s or Martin did it in the 90s or whatever. Things come back. There was a time where you really dug into why was the trend coming back. Now as the trend comes back and everybody adopts it, and it doesn't matter if it looks like what, this one did 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It doesn't matter. It's just if it's right, it's right. And, which has always been the case. When you're a visionary designer, you don't really reinvent the wheel. You just catch something and you bring it back at the time, catches the zeitgeist or something.
Definitely more recently, though, no, right? Because I feel like Diet Prada was policing that pretty hard for a while.
Yeah, they were policing it, but, it didn't stop people from buying or thinking it was cool, And I think that's the thing is, I think now a lot of what happens in fashion is you just catch the zeitgeist, you bring the right thing at the right moment, and it works and it's great. And, let's have fun with it. And if the kids love it or the 30s or 40s love it, then that's fine. That works, and it's good. There was an interview of, I don't know if I should quote him, but, a client of mine, Pierre Rougier from Alaya, he said, I used to hang out with a lot of people in fashion because we used to exchange a lot on, what we thought was like right or not right, or what we loved and we didn't love. And he said, now a lot of the conversations in fashion are about what works and what doesn't work. And, if it works, then it's a success. I think that's a big shift that I've noticed. Another shift that I've noticed in what I do, there was a time when my job was to speak to 40 people, or let's say 50 or maybe 60, make sure that they understood what the message was or what the aesthetic was, the idea of the collection or the vision of the designer was. And then those 40, 50, 60 people were in charge of broadcasting it to the world. No one had access to a show before it was time to be, almost in store. There was no images of shows. There was no images of product. So now it's all front facing. Everything is out. And then there's so much urgency to catch it really quick at the very beginning that everything has become extremely transactional. You pay influencers, you pay magazines, or you exchange one way or another. You pay celebrities to wear your clothes, It's a very transactional business now. You do affiliate marketing with magazines, you do all this stuff, because it has to come out really quick and be there. Otherwise, it's dead. That, to me, is a very different kind of interaction you have with media or with people of influence, which are usually now on TikTok, Instagram, or YouTube now is like an enormous, not now, but it's been for a while, but YouTube is an enormous influence. All of this is pretty much paid. You still have to be smart in who you pay. It's not like you just don't pay randomly. You just still have to pick who you're going to partner with or align with, how you're going to do it. But it is very, very, very transactional.
You're touching on really relevant points around things like the attention economy and how to effectively engage it. But what about the culture economy? And a brand's sort of obligation to ensure it's actually reflecting culture and not necessarily lacking in those sides of their business. That could be anything from diversity, equity, inclusion, sustainable practices, or any of those things that consumers are expecting to see more of. Are you involved in that type of a conversation and process?
Yes, I like to think we are. I think one of the big positives of the mass consumption of information around fashion is that it's hard right now to completely bullshit something or bullshit what a brand is or what a brand stands for. You cannot fake it, or at least not for a long time, because of the mass of information, because of the easy access, because of the mandatory access you have to give to such a broader audience. You really can't bullshit people for too long. Eventually they see through it. Perception is really much closer to reality normally. And if it's not, it will catch up with you. And I like that very much. Therefore, if they don't have it built in, you have to talk to clients and brands about the values that they stand for. Less and less, you cannot just like put a little coat of paint on it and hope it's going to stick. I was very, very much like known for being, or not me, but my company and the clients that I had for being very exclusive, very limited access, very kind of like, opaque. What came out was what we decided would come out. But that's over. These days are way over. You can't do this.
Do you think it's a fair statement to say that elitism has officially trended out?
I think in fashion, yeah, that's fair to say. And it's okay. Getting dressed is a very personal thing. And I think it's become more and more personal. And I think it's great that people care about, not just what they look like, but also what it says about, what community they belong to. It was always the case, but the communities were more exclusive, rarefied. Now it's okay to be in a mass community of people if the values are right. And I really, really like that.
And in that space, with all of that noise, what is it that draws your eye to a new designer that you might want to start working with today?
I have the great, great chance to be part of the LVMH Fashion Prize. We worked at the very inception of the prize with Delphine Arnault, and at the time, I was working with Dior and with Vuitton, and we worked on the concept of the LVMH Fashion Prize. So I see every year groups of young designers. I can't really pinpoint what draws my eye to it. The one thing I would say is that the designers that are inherently deeply themselves, when you meet them, you talk to them and you see their collection, it's a very stressful environment for them, a group of designers in the LVMH headquarters, there's people coming in and out, and they stand there with a model or two in front of the rack of clothes. It's a very stressful, environment to be in. And you can tell when there's perfect alignment, or at least the desire to align themselves with the rack that's standing behind them. To me, that's usually what draws my attention somehow. And it's not exactly tangible, but it's there. And I think I've learned with Martin, with Yohji, with, all these people, with Nicolas. When I worked with Martin, for example, you knew immediately if something made sense for the house, for a Maison Margiela or not. You didn't have to really think about it too much. And when it's that clear, that means that there's a world that's created around a brand, around a vision. And you can feel that very early on. If there's a universe, a world that it's, a community that it responds to, a community that it reflects or that it creates, I think you feel that, instinctually. It's more that than an aesthetic kind of, sense, really, sometimes. It's just like, there's really such a power to this little world, and then it can become a bigger world.
We can't let you go without asking you the last and final question, which is, of course, always going to be, what is contemporary now?
I knew it was coming, so I won't say that I haven't given it some thought, but I would say what's contemporary now is to challenge the algorithm. That's what I think is contemporary now, is really to try to go outside of what, is going to be spoon-fed to you through the algorithm. It requires effort. But I think that's what makes the most interesting people, young people I meet, they're the ones who literally challenge the algorithm and go beyond and go deeper or go left or right of it. I don't know if it makes sense as an answer, but that's what I feel more and more.
It does make sense. It kind of reminds me a little bit of what you had said about understanding that the antithesis of what's trending is always on the precipice of an arrival. It's kind of the outlier space. Thank you so much, Pierre. I'm glad we had the chance to do this. I know you're a busy man.
No, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of What's Contemporary Now. A special thanks to our show's producer, Cheyenne Asadi, who makes it all possible. Audio post-production by Griffin James, with original theme music by Joseph Top Miller and Chase Coughlin of The Black Soft, and visual design by Aaron Meager and Graham Prentice. Subscribe now to be the first to catch new episodes every week, and if you've enjoyed listening, we'd love to hear from you. Leave us a review and let us know your thoughts. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram, Threads, and LinkedIn for additional content and join the conversation around what is contemporary now.